Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie, and this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel, where I have a new interview every week that always has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog www.majorionbowie.com, where I have new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. Today, I'm on location in Williamstown, Massachusetts at Williams College with Professor James McAllister, the Fred Greene third century professor of political science, who teaches a class, among many others, on George Orwell in 1984. I'm here today to talk to him about 1984, which was a very influential book to David Bowie. The album Diamond Dogs is heavily influenced by the book, and Bowie never quite left the topic. In 2013, he included the book on his list of 100 most influential books, and he makes a reference to a scene in the book 1984 in one of the last songs that he ever recorded on the album Blackstar. Girl Loves Me has a line about, "I'm sitting in the Chestnut Tree," which is the name of a cafe in the story. But Diamond Dogs originally started as an attempt to make a musical of 1984, which is what Bowie wanted to do until George Orwell's widow put the kibosh on it. But I wanted to talk less about Diamond Dogs and more about the inspiration behind Diamond Dogs and this book that was so important to David Bowie, which has a resonance to this day. So Professor McAllister, thank you very much for joining me.
John, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about two great, intellectuals, artists, David Bowie and George Orwell.
Yeah.
Who are often, I never would have put them together before your invite. So,
wow, that's interesting. You say that. We were talking beforehand, and I do want to just ask you. I'm being presumptuous that people know what the book is about. But before we get to that, you had mentioned that you thought that George Orwell might have an opinion about David Bowie.
Yeah, so I'll give you my rough thought. I think Orwell, the thing that Orwell sort of had the most problem with were people who were kind of sort of overly intellectual for intellectual sake. I think Orwell had a real suspicion of people who kind of dabbled in politics, but were primarily more art-focused, university-focused. A lot of Orwell's writings were, these are the people who are the reason why we're not having movements towards socialism and greater equality. I think the other thing about Orwell is he had a real sense of what are community values, and people have to sort of be there if they're too shocking. Orwell used to write a lot about how, people who, it gets into another thing. Orwell was a deeply homophobic character, and I think a lot of Bowie's, sort of great influence appeal was, his shattering of a lot of sort of gender boundaries and other things like that. Orwell would have probably not found it possible to get past that in a lot of ways. So I think there's that, and I was saying before, if you were to line up, first of all, whenever I think of George Orwell, I don't think like, wow, he would have liked, Bruce Springsteen or the Rolling Stones or Pink Floyd. Like I think it's too different a set of worlds. But I do think if you said, hey, you've got Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, David Bowie, I think he'd say, at least the other guys are, they don't come across, they don't threaten sexuality norms and appearance norms in the same way. So I think, that's something, that, just my offhand view, I don't think. Now, I think Orwell would have been making a mistake in all of those things, but that's my rough. Orwell was, a great writer and everything else. He had some of his own prejudices and biases that he never really surmounted in his lifetime as well. Are a couple of interesting things though, if I just just thinking about it. One, obviously they both George Orwell was not Orwell's original name. He was Eric Blair.
Right.
He adopted
Yeah.
a kind of persona. Obviously, Bowie is all about different personas and different times. I think that is interesting. Both of them not university educated.
Right.
Obviously, Orwell by choice. Orwell could have done anything he wanted in those worlds. But the other great thing about Orwell is, basically Orwell's whole life is, he's born into this, what he would call lower upper middle class, which is basically, people who had a certain social standing, but didn't really have the money to live up to that social standing. That's why Orwell went into British imperial service and everything else. But Orwell then spent basically his whole life like, I'm the hero of the proletariat. I write for the working class. I adopt working class norms. Whereas Bowie's, again, whole career is, again, adopting different personas.
Yeah.
Is he Ziggy Stardust? Is he Davy Jones? Is he David Bowie? I think, they do share that sort of, they're both sort of playing a role. They're not, this is what I was born, this is what I do, which, I do find a little bit interesting. So one thing, if I could get started, which I think is interesting, I think one of the things that we probably wouldn't be having this conversation without Diamond Dogs.
Yes.
We probably might not be having this conversation if Sonia Orwell had agreed to let Bowie try and come up with a theatrical adaptation of 1984. And Bowie was always like, well, what happened here? How did this woman turn me down for this, my ideas about 1984? And he was like, well, God, her husband was a socialist with communist leanings. So this is totally, it appeared inexplicable to Bowie that she would do this. So to offer a little insight into that, first of all, remember, she really only married Orwell in the last year of his life. They'd known each other a little bit beforehand.
Which was around 1950?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Orwell died in January 1950.
Yeah.
They got married in 1949. Orwell basically knew he was in really bad health and thought, if I were married, that will help me get to better health. So, but I think the crucial moment to understanding her position, now I think it's generally agreed that Sonia did not manage Orwell's estate in a very good fashion. But I think the crucial moment here is there was a film version of Animal Farm done in the 1950s, which was basically a CIA product where they totally altered the meaning of Animal Farm in many ways. And I think that led to the general skepticism about other people adapting Orwell's projects for their own use. So I'm not sure it was so much Bowie himself, but I think she had just generally refrained from licensing any sort of projects based on Orwell's work. Orwell himself never wanted an autobiography or any kind of authorized biographies about him. The second thing is, I'm sure Sonia Orwell probably said, hey, this guy, they're probably showing her photos,
Right.
and I think she just said, this is not George's kind of guy, and I don't want to be responsible for endorsing that. What's curious, though, is I'm surprised, I think she died in the mid-'80s, and they started to loosen up some of those things. I'm surprised. It would have been interesting to know whether Bowie had ever said, hey, maybe I can now go back and think about that. I think that would have been a good kind of later stage career project for him, but I guess that did not happen.
I came across a reference that she later said something positive about Diamond Dogs.
Interesting. Okay.
So I don't know more than having just come across that.
Yeah.
But let's jump back for a moment.
Sure, absolutely.
I'm not going to assume that everybody who's watching this has the book fresh in their minds, or maybe haven't even read it. So just briefly, what is the book, and why does it still have resonance today?
So the book is written, Orwell has the idea for the book starting sort of the middle of the Second World War. It's sort of what he views as the major work of his life, in the sense of, Orwell was always, look, I want to create both a great political book, but a great artistic work, which I think he always thought all of his other books maybe had one of those elements, but not the other. So clearly he put a lot of time, energy, and thought into 1984. And it basically continues a line of thought that Orwell had for probably at least a decade, which is, you know, Orwell considered himself, to the day he died, a democratic socialist. But Orwell thought one of the main obstacles towards a democratic socialist future was the fact that many people on the left looked to the Soviet Union for inspiration, which Orwell, for a variety of reasons which we could talk about, Orwell feared. So 1984, it's obviously that regime described in 1984. That's different than kind of Soviet communism. And obviously it gets a little more complicated too, but I think Orwell was trying to say, hey, not just we should be worried about Soviet totalitarianism, but there are potential for this stuff to happen in the West as well, and hopefully this book will sort of make people think about it. It's along the lines of what he was also trying to do in Animal Farm, I think, on a more basic level. So I think that was Orwell's main purpose, which is we still need to worry about the fact that there are totalitarian societies out there, that we all in our own societies have things that could lead in a totalitarian direction, and hopefully this book will help inoculate people against it. One thing real quick, and we can talk about it, and it's a point I think you've made in a lot of your posts. Bowie did not view 1984 as a prophecy. Hey, here's what life will look like in 1984.
I don't think Orwell did either.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't mean Bowie. I meant Orwell, actually. Right. Orwell said, hey, look, if we get lax, we don't think about defending freedom and everything else, this is something that could happen, but it's certainly not something that inevitably is going to happen. And that's why he's writing the book. We could talk about how he did that and lots of other things. Obviously, part of the appeal of the book is he brings in lots of new concepts and there's a whole language, and obviously it's also partially a love story. It also seems to anticipate a lot of the sort of world we're now in with computers and surveillance and technology. So it has a lot of things that have kept it going in lots of ways.
So the language that he introduces, the surveillance, the constant surveillance, and the totalitarian control of every aspect of life are laid out in the book as mechanisms for the state to sort of erase the individual. Yeah. And you touched on a couple things that I want to discuss. Sure. His own attitudes towards sexuality make their way into this book.
Yeah.
And the idea that I originally read this book when I was in high school, which I might have read it in 1984, actually.
By the way, I first read 1984 when I was in college, in 1984.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but I always thought of it as one of my favorite books, and then I reread it over the last year, and it's funny, some things that I had forgotten, some things that I didn't.
Sure.
One of the things that I had forgotten was the Western totalitarian state, which is called Oceania.
Yep.
I think Orwell was really making a point that Britain was so insignificant that it had come to be known as Airstrip 1.
Yep.
They used the dollar as their currency. So it's suggesting that the superstate came out of the United States. So I think he was suggesting that U.S. culture was prone towards accepting a kind of authoritarian totalitarianism. Yeah. Am I reading that right?
So I think there's a couple of things going on there. One, Orwell remarkably never visited the United States, really had little interest, and his general views of the United States were not positive. I think he did see the U.S. as a kind of overly commercialized. Orwell, by the way, was very much a kind of English patriot nationalist kind of guy, really loved England in lots of ways, had problems with ruling class and everything else. I think that's a reflection of, one of the things about 1984, there's very much a geopolitical part of the story too.
Right.
This idea that the world is basically being divided into three great power centers. And clearly, I think what he wanted to get across, I think a lot of the reasons why Oceania is what it is, it's a sort of, I think, to kind of take off on NATO, which is basically America really is the military power. Great Britain is now, which actually it came to be during the Cold War, kind of base for American military power, particularly air power on the continent. It's complicated because there were continental states, but I think that's what Orwell was doing. So a lot of this is I'm not saying it's certainly not the anti-Americanism is not a big part of the book, but there is certainly that sense of let's not think of Great Britain as one of the great
Yeah.
powers of the world anymore.
Yeah.
No, we're not. We've been much reduced. By the way, just real quick for discussion, a lot of the kind of geopolitical stuff. I know historians, scholars of Orwell argue about this. A lot of this is influenced by the work of a guy by the name of James Burnham. He wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution, where he introduced a lot of the ideas. Well, Orwell also had kernels of those ideas too, but Orwell really kind of thought that we were moving into a world much like the world of 1984, where because of atomic weapons, you wouldn't have great power wars anymore. You might still have fights on the periphery. But a lot of that he got from Burnham, who basically argued, look, we're not going to have, old school capitalism might not survive, but the revolution is really going to be a revolution of managers. Basically, you're going to have intellectual, technocratic elites running societies everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
and they'd roughly all be the same. They'd have modest local versions. Those are all ideas you'll find in the Managerial Revolution, and a lot of them come in. And it's not like Orwell stole all those ideas, but he was clearly influenced by them. A lot of those geopolitical elements you can sort of see are there too.
Well, you're getting into an area that I know very little about.
Great.
So let me ask you this.
Sure.
There's so much I want to ask you. So I the INGSOC, the party, and the higher level party leaders represented by a character called O'Brien don't seem to be managers gone awry, but they seem to be, or at least O'Brien, sadist. And so he defines. This show is not what I do professionally.
Understand.
And I think I might have told you this, but not everybody who watches this knows. My career has actually been in government, and in more than 30 years in government, O'Brien's definition of power for power's sake as a motivating factor, I've either never encountered that, or power is always a means to an end, or I could think of this one guy that maybe kind of applies to, but it's sort of the exception that proves the rule. So, what is Orwell doing to go from the idea of a kind of a neutral managerial dictatorship that is unaware of the humanity to a malevolent one?
So, obviously, huge question we talk about. So let me give you my own sense about this. And, I want to say, I think you're right. It's one of the problems with 1984, which is there's very little development of how does INGSOC come to power?
Yes.
All that origins, it's sort of like they're there, but it's not clear, well, how did they get here? How could that possibly? You would think that should have been something more, particularly since a big part of 1984 is they get a copy of the sort of, hidden documents and, my God, here's the history and here's where we reveal everything. So what do I think Orwell was trying to get across there? I think, the reason why Orwell took it in that direction was, just to go back a little further, the key moment in Orwell's life, or I think one of the key moments in Orwell's life, is he goes to fight in the Spanish Civil War in 1937, and basically comes under attack, not really by fascist forces, but forces that are controlled by the Communist Party of Spain, directed by the Soviet Union. And it's something that I think Orwell never got over. It sort of changes his whole sort of focus and everything else. And what I think Orwell was trying to get across is, when you looked at societies like the Soviet Union, and by the way, I think Orwell's thoughts always were much more about the Soviet Union than Nazi Germany. I think Nazi Germany for Orwell was, all right, this is fascism. It is what it is. It's terrible. Everybody knows it.
Yeah.
They're the enemy. They're on the other side. I think for the Soviet Union, the problem that Orwell encountered was people who thought they believed in socialism and the workers. They were on that side, but Orwell's kind of view was, but wait a minute, in many ways, you guys are also oppressing workers, and this isn't going to lead to anything good.
Did he see collectivism as seductive?
So I think Orwell had a general view. I think he wasn't dogmatic. I don't think he thought about it in sort of Marxian theoretical terms. But I think Orwell basically said, hey, we should have a world run by workers and farmers, and they can all sort of do these things together. I don't think Orwell would have, another problem with Orwell that comes, not problem, Orwell was very sort of anti-technology. So I think if you had told Orwell, hey, we could collectivize the great farms of England into one big enterprise, I think Orwell would be, no, that's terrible. Everyone should have their own little small farm and everything else. So I think Orwell would have been suspicious of anything involving mechanization, greater efficiency. Orwell and socialists often used to talk about that. That's the whole Soviet Union 5-year plans. We're meeting these industrial goals. For Orwell, all that was anti-socialist. That's not the kind of way that he sort of looked at it. His argument was, look, socialism's about common decency. Everybody gets medical care. Everybody gets food. It's much less. He was not, hey, let's set up big farms and huge factories that we turn out things. So that was never sort of Orwell's vision. And I think Orwell also struggled with another part, which kind of is related to some of the things you write about Bowie and that are important. I think Orwell kind of knew that regular working people were not really attracted to some of these ideas of collectivism and everything else. And I think that's something, Orwell kind of grappled with, the last 10 years of his life. I think Orwell became much less, Orwell goes through a phase where, he'd say, hey, I'm a revolutionary. We should have a revolution. I think towards the latter part of his life, for sure, it's sort of, look, we need to move towards greater equality, a greater social, safety net. That's roughly socialism. It's much less about, bloody takeovers of power and all that other stuff. But yeah, I don't think Orwell ever fully, and it's the problem with Orwell, I think, in lots of ways, thinking about, socialism. I think Orwell was always, look, we can't impose these ideas on workers, so we can really only move as fast as other people, workers and farmers are ready to kind of move in that direction. So, I think Orwell became much less the revolution is happening, and it'll have to be a much more evolutionary process.
So getting back to his, and I'm saying his thoughts, but as expressed in the book, right, about power. And I'm mentioning this in the context of collectivism because of this character O'Brien, who's evil. Right? He seeks power only to impose suffering on other human beings. That's what he says the purpose of. That's how he defines power. But he himself is so dedicated to this movement that he doesn't seem to care about his own health. I mean, he says we're not doing this for our own wealth or for our own benefit, and that's a kind of a dedication to an abstract malevolence that I've never encountered.
So that's the other thing too. So Orwell might have said, hey, I was drawing this particularly more starkly. Yes, I'd agree with you. There probably aren't people like that. I think what Orwell wanted to sort of get across was, look, at some point, let's imagine you're a communist in the Soviet Union. Maybe at some point you did start out with, well, look, we've got to do bad things to build up the state to defend ourselves. And I think Orwell's eventual point was, look, at some point, the basic survival of the Soviet Union is no longer at risk in a world with atomic weapons. And I think the question then became, well, what is it? What is motivating people who are in the Communist Party? And I think Orwell would go back to his experiences in Spain, which is, wait a minute, we're all supposed to be fighting Francisco Franco and his fascist forces, but you guys are spending all of your time fighting against me because I'm fighting in a Trotskyist militia. So what are you doing? What is your motivation anymore? It's not to advance the cause of socialism unless you define it in some crazy way, like if I kill other fellow socialists, that will increase the cause of socialism. So I think Orwell was kind of grappling in 1984 with what is the motivation of people who are still communists today. And I think, Orwell would say, look, I think this is a problem that Orwell saw with intellectuals who were also socialists, which is their kind of view of socialism is, let's control and reform the working classes.
Yeah.
Let's make them more like us.
Yeah.
The job isn't, hey, let's help them achieve their freedom. It was more, let's live in a more orderly fashion. That was sort of Orwell's view of what English socialists were like. They weren't about socialism or about empowering workers. They were more like, hey, let's bring our middle class values to people who have working class or proletarian values. And that's what drove Orwell sort of crazy. And I think he kind of took that idea and said, well, if you keep on extending that out, eventually you'll get a party that's much more concerned about its own sake. Now, the kind of excessive, sadism, again, I think that's unrealistic.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Stalin, probably still thought till the day he died that he was doing this for, defense of the Soviet Union, hey, we'll industrialize and everything else. But I think Orwell was saying, well, extend that out a couple of generations and it basically will become nihilism. And, I think the other thing is, the whole idea of, how do you ensure a revolution lasts forever? Well, if you can change all of the words and the language through other kind of control techniques, people won't even be able to express ideas of resistance, rebellion. And I think Orwell, again, he was taking things that he saw and just taking them to another level. I mean, the Soviet Union did airbrush people out of photos who, used to be there standing next to, Lenin and Stalin, and they became unpersons and disappeared. 2 + 2 = 5. That actually does come from an example of Soviet propaganda, where they, I forgot the exact reference, but those are things from real life that Orwell then sort of embellished in lots of ways.
Yeah, and the 2 + 2 = 5. What is the line? The party told you to reject
everything
evidence
before you.
Yeah,
we tell you this, and
right, and that's why, right? So that's a mechanism of control.
Yes.
Yeah.
Basically, look, if you can get people to, again, double think, which is, in your one head what the real answer is, but then on the other hand, you can say with equal conviction the opposite. Lots of things like that. For me, that's not, it's interesting and important, and we see evidence of it, even today. But there, I think Orwell was just basically, look, I grew up in the, politically in the 30s and 40s, and I've seen all of these things, and he's just basically taking a lot of stuff from, Soviet propaganda, Soviet control, and just saying, hey,
So let me ask you about something that I think he, this is my personal opinion, that he kind of got wrong.
Let's hear it.
So we sort of touched on in the beginning is his treatment of sexuality. So his again in the book, the state suppresses sexuality as a mechanism for control. So keeping in mind that this is a Western superstate, it seems to me that in the contemporary appeal, not to myself, but to those who find an appeal in the idea of turning to an authoritarian scheme, part of the compact is sexual, like the Big Brother type, or is offering a kind of a license to those who are of his class or of his type, or who take his hand.
Right.
Whereas Orwell's totalitarian state is trying to stomp out the sexual impulse altogether.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk about this. First of all, Orwell and sexuality. Not something he wrote about.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of biographies that Orwell sort of sexual life more complicated than people thought, or he hinted at. He appears to have been much more of a womanizer than people have thought about. In the past, there's very little sex in most Orwell, novels before 1984. I think his basic point. In 1984, which I think is a good element, which is his argument is the whole point of INSOC is to discourage pleasure in any ways. Obviously, sex is pleasurable, and that's why he's attracted to Julia, a woman who really revels in being a sexual being. And for Orwell, this is, and for Winston Smith, this is a true act of rebellion. You can't rebel any more than this. Arguments about other authoritarians. It's not about repressing sexual urges, but saying to certain people, "Hey, if we're in power, we're going to be much more conducive to what you think here." Some of the posts you've developed about sort of current things. I think there's a lot of validity to them. I think in many respects, again, Orwell is often castigated for his treatment of women in lots of his books. You might not be familiar, but some of your audience might know there was a book put out a couple of years ago, by the way, licensed by the Orwell estate, called Julia by Sandra Newman, which tells the story of 1984 from Julia's perspective, which is a kind of interesting take. I don't think it replaces 1984 in any way. So my own thought was, that makes sense to me, but I think in reality, things have gone in different directions with this. You don't have this idea of, conservative movements should be all about repressing sexuality. No, that's not the current premise. I don't think. It's more encouraging a certain kind of sexuality and legitimate sexual relations rather than a blanket sort of suppression. I'm trying to think. I think the Soviet Union and China, for example, take them during their heyday. I don't think they promoted a kind of idea of sexual freedom and political freedom going together. I think there the sort of repression was sort of there, although obviously the problem is authoritarian regimes generally do want more children as well. So that's the other thing. But that's how they handled it in 1984, which is sex is solely for procreation. It's not for fun or enjoyment or anything.
The world is divided into these three, as you said, three super states. And then there are most of Africa is just like a battleground.
That's it.
So the one class of people that's treated less respectfully than the proles are Africans.
Absolutely.
But
something that Orwell does not, by the way, go into very much. You can imagine 1984 as a 1,000-page book where you dealt with all of that, dealt with that very sparingly.
I think I had this thought of like Tolkien wrote it. He would have done a whole separate book of just backstory.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
but I do want to ask about.
By the way, can I interview one thing? Because I should have brought this up earlier, but another very interesting parallel between Orwell and Bowie, and we'll come back to this. A lot of people, because Orwell died shortly after the publication of 1984, many people have argued, well, this is Orwell's last will and testament. He knew he was dying, and he wanted to produce this book. It's totally false. Orwell did not know that he was dying. He didn't know that he didn't have another book or two in him. He thought, hey, I'm sick, but maybe it become a chronic condition. I can do it. And obviously the same thing, I think a lot of Bowie fans believe. Blackstar is, hey, I'm going to die. Here's my last testament before I do so. And I think people close to Bowie thought he had more time to produce more work. So that actually is an interesting parallel between their two works. And I'll give you another interesting parallel that I came across. And this is probably a topic for a different person than me, but I noticed that you think Blackstar is the number one. Is that correct? Like I saw something where you and I think someone else ranked Bowie albums, or is that?
I did not rank it as number one. But what I think you came across was I did not a scientific review, but I looked up all the rankings I could find, and Blackstar. Well, there's a couple things. Blackstar appears as the number one on some lists.
Gotcha. Interesting.
And also, at the beginning, so we were talking in the year 2025. At the beginning of this year, there were a series of music magazines, either online or in print, that ranked albums of the century, so the last 25 years.
Gotcha.
And Blackstar, quite apart from ranking of Bowie albums, appeared near the top of the list of best albums of the century thus far.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
you might have encountered one of those two.
I think I countered one of them. I thought it was a ranking that you approved because I saw that Tonight was number 27 in terms of Bowie, which I guess is
I
universally
think
agreed is his worst thing.
might have been
Right.
I did the ranking of rankings, right? I did an
Yes.
aggregation
Gotcha.
of,
Okay.
yeah.
So the reason why I thought that was interesting is I think a lot of people assume that 1984 is Orwell's best work.
Yes.
I would rather I like some of Orwell's other novels better. That's a minority opinion, but I would just say I'm not sure. There's lots of other great Orwell novels out there. Just as I'm sure people argue over where Bowie should be
That's
right.
all they do. It's argue.
I think there are a lot of people who are like, give me Homage to Catalonia over.
I was going to ask because you mentioned Animal Farm. It's like, well, what would you recommend?
I like Animal Farm too. I think 1984 is the more substantial work of those two. But I like some of the Orwell novels that Orwell himself doesn't like. I love Keep the Aspidistra Flying. I love Coming Up for Air. It's actually, by the way, another parallel between Orwell and Bowie. Just as I think Bowie, it's like, hey, look, some albums I made I'm not proud of.
Yeah.
I don't think they're great. I think Orwell had novels that he didn't think were his best work. Although I think some people find them really good.
So just to put you on the spot, what's your favorite George Orwell novel? That's not the main purpose of this interview. So.
Yeah, if someone came up to me and said, "Hey, I've read 1984. What else can I read by Orwell that I'd like?" I like Keep the Aspidistra Flying, which I think is a kind of obscure thing.
So,
it's got an interesting book. It obviously plays off, some things that are real about Orwell, some things that are fictional. He did work in a bookstore and things like that. I like Coming Up for Air too. I think those are really good. Now, they don't have 1/1000th of the influence of either Animal Farm or 1984, but they're good and they're different. By the way, they're very nothing science, fiction about them. Very straightforward, much more revealing, I think, of Orwell.
So I want to ask you a question that mentions Bowie, but this is not about Bowie. I interpret Diamond Dogs as kind of 1983.
Totally correct.
Okay.
Keep on going.
All right. So let me just sort of set it up and then hand it over. So the album ends with the song Big Brother, and the crowd is chanting, "We want you, Big Brother."
That is correct.
And you realize at that point, we have not been living in the world of 1984, but we've been going through this dystopia that was so it was so dispiriting that there's another song, the Sweet Thing Candidate, Sweet Thing, where the end of a date is suicide.
Yes.
Oh, we'll buy some drugs and watch a band and jump in the river holding hands. It is such a dispiriting place that the crowd at the end calls for Big Brother.
Yes.
So what? We touched on this a little bit, and he doesn't go into that great detail.
Sure.
What is he suggesting were the conditions that led to an acceptance of this regime?
Great. So let's approach that from several levels. But I want to say you're absolutely right about this. If you interpret Diamond Dogs as somehow Orwell's 1984 put to music, totally false. Diamond Dogs should really be understood as the prelude that leads to that sort of regime. Now, the other thing about this that I think is interesting is, and I think it's to his credit, I don't think Bowie would have been interested in doing a literal translation of 1984 into a theater presentation. So I think he would have said, hey, let's look around me at the world I'm living in and other things, and come up with a 1984, which might have a similar arc, a fear of a possible dystopian future. But I think that really that album is, hey, if we wanted to understand Ingsoc, here's how we could do it. A society in absolute misery, chaos, anarchy, people giving up, suicides at the end of dates, dogs as big as cats, as big as rats, all the stuff that he does. You could imagine that sort of scenario. Now, a couple of things that are interesting is, and I think you hit on it in some of your posts. The one thing that Orwell does an absolutely terrible job of in 1984 is, it starts out, the party is there, Ingsoc is there. You think you're going to get revealed, the history of how all of this happened, but there isn't anything. There isn't anything. Did Ingsoc come to power because of a military coup or, God forbid, elections or anything else like that? There's nothing. They're just sort of there, which I think is a real weakness. I think Orwell needed to at least provide some hints as to how that happened. He did not. He totally stayed away from that. And it is a real problem. And I'm sure a lot of people are like, this makes no sense. You could not imagine this happening in a kind of Western context, a Great Britain or America. And I think that is true. Now, to his credit, I think Bowie. Now, I've heard a couple of things that Bowie sort of was coming back across the Soviet Union from a tour of Japan. And that's when he sort of said, oh my God, this is where 1984, the idea of this all really hit him, which I think is interesting. But I think, the way to really think about 1984 is, Bowie kind of trying to speculate about, if society really gets to this point, a sort of world, you can imagine like Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, just absolutely brutal and nihilistic. Well, then eventually even people participating in this world would say, hey, we want order, we want stability, we want someone to come save us, someone who will fool us and lie to us, but we'll then believe in all of that. So I actually give Bowie sort of credit for that, which is not sort of, again, thinking about let's do 1984 and we'll go from here to here to here. I think he was trying to say, hey, how would I come up with a new way to kind of think about how we wind up that's relevant to, the 1970s, a world where capitalism versus socialism is no longer the sort of main issue. There are other bigger things involved here.
Yeah.
So can I offer one other view that maybe you disagree with? I think we'll come to this in the end. I think the most successful songs on Diamond Dogs are actually the ones that have the least connection to the sort of 1984 theme.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting. Now, you can always say, hey, let's try and, you probably know this a little more than me, but doing a little reading up on it, which is Orwell sort of took stuff, Bowie sort of took stuff from William Burroughs and a whole bunch of other things. I think the more successful songs on the album come more from the William S. Burroughs side of things than the Bowie side of things. Although Diamond Dogs has grown on me. I really like it a lot more. After repeated listens, and I'll save something for the end. But
it's part of my interest in this topic is that it's one of my favorite albums, and I've recognized that it's a merger of different influences, and then his own. I don't want to do too much of the talking, but his own. He had an interest in this relationship between the rock star, the demagogue, the religious figure, and then the audience, the parishioners, the followers. Yeah. And like we were talking about the song "Big Brother," he has a similar theme that he touches on in an earlier song called "Savior Machine." Yeah. Where the collective gives up its agency to somebody to solve its problems for them, and the machine reaches the conclusion that it's going to kill them. Yeah. Right. And and there's many other songs where, well, even on the album itself, on Diamond Dogs, I was blown away he thought that the song "Rock and Roll with Me," which I thought had nothing to do with the rest of the album, he thought that had the most to do with the idea of,
I read that too.
Yeah, and it's because of the relationship between the singer and the audience. And he himself, he's up there as this young man watching this worshipful audience do whatever he wanted them to do. And I think that there's, the fictional Big Brother, right? Is like, I come away from reading this book thinking that Winston Smith, the protagonist, even asks the question, does Big Brother exist like you and I do? And O'Brien says something like, just the same as you and I do, but that does not mean that objectively, yes, right?
Right.
So it's also, and now I'm doing too much talking, but it's like, does David Bowie really exist? He never even changed his name to David Bowie, right? And
That's correct. Yes.
David Bowie's a meta character
Yes.
who would play
His credit
other
cards
characters.
are all Davy Jones.
Yeah.
Right to the end.
Those are, he would sign
Yeah.
legal documents, and
Yeah.
and now I'm just talking. But
No worries.
a later song, DJ, I Am a DJ. He loved to have songs that had different meanings, but
Yes.
one interpretation of that is, I am a DJ, I am David Jones. I am what I play. I'm these characters that I play.
Interesting.
Right? And this is just a concept that he never dropped. And it's, again, it's this idea of blurring reality with fantasy, which is weaponized in this book.
Yeah.
The state, again, that quote, which is, I'm cheating because it's on the back of the book. It says, the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears, and it was their final, most essential command. Don't believe what you see, believe what we tell you. Yeah. And it's a power dynamic, because on some level, that Ziggy Stardust is a fictional character,
but you have to suspend that belief.
You have to suspend that belief.
Yeah.
On some level, that the pro wrestling match has a predetermined outcome, but you don't act that way. And on some level, the 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah, absolutely. You have that great quote about. Actually, I'll save that for later. But one of the things that I think is a really interesting point. It's another big difference between Orwell and Bowie, and just from various things I've read. That whole early 70s period was crazy, and I think Bowie was a thoughtful enough person to say, this really is a dangerous relationship where I could tell crowds things that disinformation or anything else, and they will follow me anyway. And I think he had enough self-awareness to say, well, it's not necessarily because I'm great or wonderful that this is a healthy relationship. In other words, he did have a real suspicion of the motivations of crowds. A total contrast to Orwell. I think Orwell's kind of guiding motivation is the masses have to be right. The masses are basically decent, left to their own devices. They will make the right choices unless they're kind of, skewed by malevolent, intellectuals or individuals. That's a big difference. Whereas I think Bowie was much more, and again, I think obviously his career went in sort of different directions after this, where it was much less dangerous relationship between star, performer, and audience. And I think that's the other great thing about Bowie too, which is his willingness to change styles all the time, which is to basically say, hey, if you like this last one, well, here, I'm going in a different direction. You can follow me, not follow me. I don't really care, which again, I think is a real sign of, artistic integrity. It's one of the things I've come across, which is, yes, he made his, concessions to commercialism and everything else. But for the most part, for a career that lasted as long as he did have a really basic sense of artistic integrity that a lot of his contemporaries obviously did not,
He is the only one I could think of who gave the fans what they didn't want.
Yes, and yes, in so many cases. I think that is exactly right. Compare that to, the Rolling Stones who, hey, let me roll out the same arena show for 40 years and, it's all about making as much money as possible. And from all accounts, that was not Bowie. That was not, I think he had that one moment, the Let's Dance era, where, hey, I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm going to go on MTV. But, he got past that fairly quickly. Well, we could talk, but yeah.
I'll have you come back and we'll do the Let's Dance show.
Yeah.
But so the way the book ends, the way the main story of the book ends, and there is an afterwards,
right,
which is a separate discussion. But the last line of the book is, Winston loved Big Brother, so he's finally broken.
Yes, and that's also the condition of being released from this. The party. We will not kill you until you finally accept this in your heart and mind. And so that's his liberation. Once he recognizes that, they can put the bullet in the back of his head and move on. It's not a happy ending.
It's not a happy ending.
No, I think that's totally appropriate.
I think so. you are a professor of political science and not of literature,
Yes.
and my my educational background is also in political science and not in literature, and I read this almost like a dramatized essay about different political concepts. Um, there are elements of it as a story that they work and that they're engaging,
Right.
but if you put too much thought into it, it sort of breaks down as a
Yeah,
story.
I think that's right.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I think it's a lot of reason why, I think a lot of people who read, Orwell beyond 1984 and Animal Farm, kind of appreciate the virtues of some of his other books.
yeah,
I think that's right. There's only so far you can push some of this stuff. Some of it becomes very repetitive. Um, Again, I think everyone should read 1984.
yeah,
Like you shouldn't be able to get a college degree without having read 1984. I think it's good in knocking down, ideas on the right and the left. It's, and I think that's important. I think that's part of the reason why Orwell is a beloved figure. He was certainly a man of the left himself, considered himself a democratic socialist, but he was much of what he wrote was much more critical of his own side than the other side, which I think gives him a lot of integrity. It's why people as diverse as Christopher Hitchens and Elon Musk can both find Orwell to be such an inspiring figure. It makes no sense, but we don't have too many people who have those sort of allegiances across
yeah.
ideological divides.
So that sort of sets up a good way to sort of land the plane on this. So Orwell doesn't give us the solution, and that actually is also a similarity with Bowie. Many of Bowie's songs are depressing. They shine a light on a problem without offering a solution.
Yeah.
And in this book, a book that ends with the main character being completely broken, he doesn't give us a solution. What is the virtue in putting out a piece of art that doesn't provide a way out?
So here's what I think Orwell would say to that question, which is, look, by writing this book, the next time someone comes along and says, hey, I'm setting up a movement for the liberation of the masses and the workers, and in order to be a part of that, you have to blindly follow me, and I'm going to tell you 2 + 2 = 5, and you're going to believe it. I think Orwell is trying to kind of a general antidote against authoritarianism, lying, skepticism towards all sort of political claims. Again, all good political virtues for anyone to follow.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing.
Yeah.
So this, as far as I know, the book has never been out of print. I think it's still a big seller, and you teach a class about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, in 2017, it became a #1 New York Times bestseller after the kind of Trump inaugural and the whole thing about the crowd size and whether it was accurate or not. I think sales increased every kind of political cycle. It'll be a perennial book.
I think if you haven't read it at all, or if you haven't read it in a while, and you reread it now, it is striking that these words were put together in 1947. Was it?
Yeah, I mean, published in 1949.
Yeah,
but again, he
but not last year.
Not last year. No, definitely not. Definitely not.
Yeah. So, well, Professor McAllister, this has been terrific. Thank you so much for giving me the time and your insights. I do want to close by asking you a sort of a silly question that I ask everybody.
No problem.
What is your favorite David Bowie song and album?
So, before this is meeting with you, I certainly would have said "Heroes" was my favorite David Bowie song. I'll leave aside the question of what my favorite album would have been, but I will say, maybe it's because I've been playing it repeatedly, but I think the actual song "Diamond Dogs," I'm surprised. Like, look, for someone like me, a more let's go back. The first David Bowie song I ever heard was "Fame," probably when I was 11 years old. So Diamond Dogs is before my consciousness of music. But I think the title track is just fabulous. I think it's, I don't know why I didn't hear it on the radio as much as I heard Rebel Rebel or Suffragette City. I just think it's a really fabulous song. I believe I read that Bowie actually plays guitar on it too, which is amazing.
That's him,
It is
yeah.
just such a great guitar song. I mean, even if the lyrics are a little obscure. So at the moment, that is my favorite David Bowie song. I've been listening to Low a lot lately, which is
Yeah.
fabulous. All that stuff. So I'm very excited just to reacquaint myself with Bowie the '70s, because I feel like I wasn't as appreciative as I should have been at the time. So
Well, Professor James McAllister, thank you very much. This
absolute
has been
pleasure, John.
wonderful.
Thanks. I've really enjoyed it.